Ethan Rusk came to collect what was owed. But the town he rode into wasn't on any map, the people wouldn't say the year, and the man he came to find might already be buried, or never born. Ethan Rusk was a silhouette against the harsh desert sun, a figure carved from grit and regret. His face, a roadmap of hard living, was framed by a worn Stetson. He wasn't a good man, not by any stretch, but he was a man of his word, or more accurately, a man who kept his contracts. His reputation preceded him, a whisper of calculated violence that made men settle debts quicker than a rattlesnake strike. He'd seen too much, done too much, and the weight of it all settled heavy in his bones. The glint in his steely eyes wasn't just the reflection of the sun, it was the cold, hard light of a man who'd stared into the abyss and found it staring back. This job, like most, was simple: find a man named Silas, collect what was owed, and move on. Redemption, the town where Silas was holed up, was just another stop on a long, dusty trail. He figured it would be an easy payday, a quick in and out. He was wrong. He adjusted his gun belt, the leather creaking a familiar song. He spurred his horse onward, toward the shimmering horizon and the town that held a secret darker than the deepest mine shaft. He didn't know it yet, but redemption wasn't just a town, it was a trap. The contract itself was unremarkable, a single sheet of paper detailing the sum owed and Silas's last known whereabouts. Mr. Blackwood, a man whose face was as creased as the document, had presented it with a nervous cough. Blackwood, who never told Ethan what the debt was about, only that Silas was overdue. "Find him, Rusk," Blackwood had rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Get what's owed, I don't care how." Ethan hadn't asked questions, he never did. Questions were for men who wanted to know things, and Ethan had long ago learned that ignorance was a shield. The less you knew, the less you had to regret. The sum was considerable, enough to buy Ethan a small ranch, maybe even a fresh start, though he doubted he deserved one. Still, the lure of escape was strong. It was an empty promise, perhaps, but a promise nonetheless. He'd tucked the contract into his saddlebag, the paper a silent testament to the task ahead. He patted his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa named Jericho, who seemed to share Ethan's weariness. "All right, Jericho," he'd murmured, "let's go collect." The desert stretched before them, an endless expanse of sand and sun, leading to redemption and a reckoning neither of them could foresee. Ethan just hoped that the debt was one he could live with collecting. Redemption appeared on the horizon like a mirage, shimmering in the afternoon heat. As Ethan and Jericho drew closer, the illusion solidified into something tangible, yet disturbingly off-kilter. The buildings were freshly painted, their colors too vibrant, too new. The streets were swept clean, devoid of the usual dust and debris that clung to every other town in the territory. There wasn't a stray dog in sight, no horses hitched haphazardly to the saloon, no children playing in the streets. Only an unnatural stillness, a silence that pressed in on Ethan's ears. He slowed Jericho to a walk, his senses on high alert. The air itself felt thick, heavy with an unspoken secret. He noticed the neat rows of identical flowers lining the walkways, each one perfectly bloomed, their petals unblemished. A sign hung above the entrance to the town proclaimed, "Welcome to Redemption, a town reborn." The words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to mask something rotten beneath the surface. Ethan felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. He scanned the faces of the few people he saw, their expressions blank, almost vacant. Their clothes, while clean, seemed oddly dated, a mishmash of styles from different eras. It was like stepping into a stage play where the actors hadn't quite learned their roles. Something was deeply wrong with redemption. Ethan dismounted in front of the saloon, the swinging doors creaking open with an unnatural slowness, as if hesitant to disturb the silence. He tied Jericho to the hitching post, the only horse in sight, and stepped inside. The interior was just as unsettling as the exterior. The air was thick with the scent of stale beer and something else, something indefinable like old perfume and regret. A handful of patrons sat at tables, their conversations hushed, their eyes darting nervously in his direction. He approached the barkeep, a man with a meticulously groomed mustache and a vacant stare. "Whiskey," Ethan said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to echo in the stillness. The barkeep poured a shot, his movements precise and mechanical. Ethan tossed it back, the burn doing little to thaw the chill that had settled over him. "I'm looking for a man named Silas," he said, setting the glass down with a deliberate thud. The barkeep's eyes flickered, a brief spark of something akin to fear before returning to their vacant state. "Silas," he repeated, his voice flat. "Don't know no Silas here." Ethan surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on each of the patrons. One by one they averted their eyes, their silence more telling than any denial. It was as if the name Silas was a forbidden word, a ghost that haunted Redemption's pristine facade. "Nobody knows Silas?" Ethan asked, his voice laced with a hint of steel. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner, counting down to something unknown. A woman with a high-collared dress and an elaborate hairstyle approached Ethan, her movements stiff and unnatural. "Are you new to Redemption, sir?" she asked, her voice a delicate, almost childlike whisper. "Passing through," Ethan replied, keeping his eyes on her. "Looking for someone." "Redemption is a town of new beginnings," she said, her gaze unfocused. "We leave the past behind us here." "Is that so?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. "What year is it, ma'am?" The woman blinked, her expression shifting from vacant to confused. "Why, it's the year of our Lord," she trailed off, her brow furrowing. I can't quite recall." Another man, dressed in a tweed suit that seemed decades out of date, chimed in. "It's 1888, of course, the year of the Great Exhibition." "No, no," a third voice piped up, an elderly man in a Confederate uniform. "It's 63, the year Gettysburg turned the tide." Ethan stared at them, the pieces of the puzzle refusing to fit. The townsfolk spoke in fragmented sentences, their memories disjointed, their sense of time warped. It was as if they were all living in different eras, trapped in a shared delusion. He was no longer certain if they were simply hiding something or if they were genuinely lost. The woman looked at him with wide, pleading eyes. "Please," she whispered, "don't ask questions. It's better if you just forget." Ethan ignored the woman's plea, his resolve hardening with each unanswered question. He moved from the saloon into the street, the sun beating down on him, casting long, distorted shadows. He approached a group of men gathered around a game of checkers, their faces etched with a similar unsettling blankness. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the silence. "I'm looking for Silas. Anyone know him?" The men stopped their game, their eyes locking onto Ethan with a mixture of fear and hostility. One by one they shook their heads, their movements almost robotic. "Never heard of him," one of them muttered, his voice barely audible. "No Silas here," another echoed, his gaze darting nervously around. Ethan pressed on, his patience wearing thin. "He's supposed to be living here. Medium height, scar on his left cheek. Goes by Silas." The men remained silent, their faces like masks. Ethan could feel their collective resistance, a wall of denial that he couldn't break through. It was as if Silas had been erased from their memories, or perhaps he had never existed at all. The absence of Silas was becoming more than just a missing person. It was a gaping hole in the fabric of redemption, a void that threatened to swallow everything whole. Ethan knew with a growing certainty that finding Silas was the key to unlocking the town's secrets, to understanding the madness that gripped its inhabitants. He turned away from the men, his jaw tight. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "I'll find him myself." As Ethan walked through Redemption, he paid closer attention to his surroundings, noticing details he had initially overlooked. The wood of the buildings wasn't just painted, it was flawlessly preserved without a single crack or splinter. The ironwork on the balconies was free of rust, gleaming as if newly forged. Even the dust seemed to be swept away moments after it settled, leaving an almost sterile environment. There were no cobwebs in the corners of windows, no faded paint on the signs, no signs of wear and tear that were common in every other frontier town he had ever visited. He ran his hand along a wooden fence, expecting to feel the rough texture of aged wood, but instead it was smooth and unblemished. He knelt down and examined the ground, searching for signs of decay, for fallen leaves, for anything that suggested the passage of time. But there was nothing. The soil was rich and dark, as if constantly replenished, but devoid of the usual signs of life and death. It was as if redemption existed outside the natural cycle, untouched by the ravages of time. The town was not simply clean, it was unnaturally preserved, frozen in a perpetual state of newness. This realization sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. It wasn't just a town trying to hide its past, It was a town trying to defy nature itself. He knew then that he had stumbled into something far stranger and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. As Ethan stood in the center of the town square, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over him. The world seemed to tilt, the colors blurring at the edges. For a fleeting moment, the pristine facade of redemption dissolved, replaced by a starkly different reality. He saw the buildings as they truly were, dilapidated, their paint peeling, their foundations crumbling. The streets were choked with mud and refuse, the air thick with the stench of decay. He saw people, not the vacant-eyed mannequins he had encountered, but desperate, haggard figures, their faces marked by hardship and despair. He heard the sounds of a town in chaos, drunken shouts, weeping women, the crack of gunfire. He saw a flash of violence, a brawl erupting outside the saloon, a man being dragged down an alleyway, a woman screaming in terror. The vision lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to shatter Ethan's perception of redemption. The perfect town was a lie, a carefully constructed illusion masking a dark and violent past. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving him disoriented and shaken. The pristine redemption was back, but Ethan knew what lay beneath the surface. He stumbled back, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. He wasn't just dealing with a town that was hiding something, he was dealing with a town that was actively rewriting its own history. And he was beginning to suspect that he was the only one who could see the truth. Ethan decided to seek out whoever was in charge. He found the mayor's office in a freshly painted building near the town square. The door was open, and he walked in without knocking. The mayor, a man with slicked-back hair and an unsettlingly charming smile, rose from behind a large oak desk. "Mr. Rusk, isn't it?" he said, his voice smooth as silk. "We were expecting you." Ethan's hand instinctively went to his gun. "Expecting me? How's that?" The mayor chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "Redemption is a small town, news travels fast, and you've been asking about Sila's, a disruptive influence, I'm afraid." "Disruptive?" Ethan asked, his eyes narrowing. "He owes a debt." "Debts can be forgiven, Mr. Rusk," the mayor said, his smile never faltering. "Especially when they threaten the peace and tranquility of our community. And Sila's threatens that." "Let's just say Sila's doesn't quite fit in here," the mayor replied, his gaze hardening. "He clings to the past, to things best forgotten. We prefer to look to the future, to a brighter tomorrow." He stepped closer to Ethan, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mr. Rusk, I understand you're a man of business. I'm prepared to offer you a generous sum to simply leave. Forget about Sila's, forget about redemption." Ethan stared at the mayor, his mind racing. "And if I refuse?" The mayor's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Then you'll find that redemption can be a very unforgiving place." He leaned back, a silent dismissal. "I suggest you consider my offer carefully, Mr. Rusk, before it's too late." Ethan ignored the mayor's threat and left the office, his mind churning. He needed to understand what was happening in redemption, and he had a feeling the answer lay hidden in the town's past. He rode Jericho to the outskirts of town, following a barely discernible path that led to a small, overgrown hill. At the top of the hill, shrouded in the shade of ancient oaks, was a cemetery. It was unlike any cemetery Ethan had ever seen. Rows upon rows of headstones stood in perfect alignment, but all were blank, their surfaces smooth and featureless. It was as if the identities of the deceased had been deliberately erased. He walked among the graves, a sense of dread creeping over him. The silence here was even more profound than in the town, a silence that spoke of forgotten lives and buried secrets. Then he saw it. At the far end of the cemetery, nestled between two rows of blank headstones, was a single grave with an inscription. He approached it slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The inscription read, "Ethan Rusk." The dates beneath his name were yet to be filled in, a chilling reminder of his own mortality, of the fate that awaited him in this strange and unsettling town. Ethan stared at the headstone, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. Was this a warning, a threat, or something else entirely? He was no longer sure of anything. The line between reality and nightmare was blurring, and he felt like he was teetering on the edge of madness. Shaken by the discovery of his own grave, Ethan returned to town, determined to uncover the truth about redemption's past. He started at the library, a small, unassuming building that seemed strangely untouched by the town's artificial perfection. He found the librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a weary smile, dusting the shelves. He asked her about the town's history, about any records or documents that might shed light on its past. The librarian hesitated, her smile fading. "The past is best left undisturbed, young man," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to know," Ethan insisted, his voice firm. "Something terrible happened here, didn't it?" The librarian sighed, her gaze drifting towards the window. "There was a fire," she said, her voice trembling. "A terrible fire that destroyed most of the town. Many lives were lost." "And that's all?" Ethan asked, sensing that she was holding something back. The librarian shook her head, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "There were other things," she whispered. "Things I can't speak of, things that should never be remembered." Despite her reluctance, Ethan managed to convince her to show him a hidden archive in the basement. There, buried beneath stacks of forgotten books, he found a collection of old newspapers, their pages yellowed and brittle. As he read through them, a horrifying picture began to emerge, a story of greed, betrayal, and a terrible act of violence that had scarred Redemption forever, a past the town was desperately trying to bury. It became clear why the town tried to forget it. The question was, could he? Sitting in the darkened saloon, nursing a whiskey, Ethan wrestled with his conscience. The newspapers painted a grim picture of Silas, a ruthless businessman who had exploited the town's resources, driving many into poverty. He'd been at the heart of the conflict that led to the fire, though the details were murky, obscured by time and the town's collective amnesia. Was Silas a villain, a scapegoat? Ethan couldn't be sure, but one thing was clear: collecting a debt from him in this twisted reality felt wrong. He thought about Mr. Blackwood, the man who had hired him. What did Blackwood know about Redemption? Had he deliberately sent Ethan into this nightmare, or was he as ignorant as Ethan had been? The money Blackwood offered had seemed like a path to redemption, a chance to escape his own troubled past. But now the thought of profiting from this town's suffering filled him with disgust. He looked around the saloon at the vacant faces of the townsfolk trapped in their self-imposed delusion. Were they victims or accomplices? Did they deserve to be freed from their prison, even if it meant confronting the horrors of their past? Ethan took a long swig of his whiskey, the burning liquid doing little to ease the turmoil in his soul. He was a hired gun, a man who followed orders. But could he follow this order? Could he collect this debt, knowing what he now knew? He knew the answer deep down, he just didn't know what he was going to do about it. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Rusk felt lost. His simple mission was now a complex moral quagmire, and he was sinking fast. The next morning, Ethan found that Redemption had subtly shifted. The colors seemed brighter, the smiles wider, the silence even more oppressive. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but the town's illusion was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. He walked past the saloon, and for a moment he saw it as it had been in his vision, dilapidated and chaotic. But then the illusion snapped back into place, and it was pristine again, the change almost imperceptible. He tried to ask the barkeep about the fire, but the man simply stared at him blankly, as if Ethan had spoken in a foreign language. The townsfolk seemed to be actively resisting his attempts to break through their delusion, their minds closing in on themselves. Ethan started experiencing moments of disorientation, brief flashes of the past bleeding into the present. He would see a glimpse of a burning building or hear the echo of a scream, only to have it vanish moments later, leaving him confused and uncertain. He began to doubt his own sanity. Was he imagining things? Was he succumbing to the town's madness? Or was he the only sane man in a town gone mad? The Ethan Rusk who had arrived in Redemption was slowly disappearing, replaced by someone else, someone more susceptible to the town's influence. The lines between reality and illusion were blurring, and he was losing his grip on what was real. He knew that if he stayed in Redemption much longer, he might never escape. The town was consuming him, body and soul. Driven to the brink of madness, Ethan decided to confront the mayor again. But the mayor's office was empty, the door ajar, the room filled with an unsettling silence. He searched the town, his desperation growing with each passing moment. Finally, he found a clue, a faded handbill tacked to a wall advertising a revival meeting at an abandoned church on the outskirts of town. He rode to the church, the air growing heavy with anticipation. Inside, bathed in the ethereal glow of moonlight, he found Silas. Silas was not what Ethan expected. He was not a ruthless businessman or a villainous figure. He was a broken man, his face etched with sorrow, his eyes filled with a haunting knowledge. "You found me," Silas said, his voice a raspy whisper. "I knew someone would eventually." "What's going on here, Silas?" Ethan demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "What is this place?" Silas sighed, his shoulders slumping. "This town," he said, "is trapped in a loop, reliving its darkest day over and over again." He explained that the fire was not an accident but a deliberate act of vengeance, fueled by greed and hatred. The town, consumed by guilt and remorse, had somehow become trapped in time, forced to relive its trauma for eternity. "And you?" Ethan asked. "What's your role in all this?" "I was there," Silas said, his voice filled with self-loathing. "I was part of it, and now I'm cursed to watch it happen again and again, powerless to stop it." He added that Ethan was not there by chance. Ethan was needed, but Ethan was not ready to learn what he was needed for. "What do you mean I'm needed?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Silas looked at him with a profound sadness. "You are the key, Ethan. You have the strength, the will to break the loop, but it will require a sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Ethan demanded, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. "A part of yourself," Silas said, his voice barely audible. "You must confront your own demons, your own past sins. Only by accepting responsibility for your actions can you free this town from its torment." Silas explained that Ethan's arrival was not random. The town, in its subconscious desire to escape its fate, had called out to him, drawn him into its time loop. Ethan's past, his own history of violence and regret, mirrored the town's own darkness. "The headstone," Ethan whispered, remembering the chilling discovery in the cemetery. "It wasn't a threat, it was a prophecy." Silas nodded. "You must choose, Ethan. You can leave this town, collect your money, and forget about all of this. Or you can stay, confront your past, and help redemption find its peace. But know this, the choice you make will determine not only the fate of this town, but also your own." Ethan stared at Silas, his mind reeling. He was a hired gun, a man who had always lived on the fringes of society. Now he was being asked to save a town, to become something more than he ever thought possible. He had a choice to make, and the clock was ticking. Ethan spent the night wrestling with his decision. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over redemption, he knew what he had to do. He saddled Jericho and rode into the town square, the heart of redemption's illusion. The townsfolk were going about their usual routines, their faces blank, their movements mechanical. Ethan drew his gun and fired a shot into the air. The sound echoed through the square, shattering the silence and drawing the attention of everyone present. "Listen to me," Ethan shouted, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "This town is a lie. You're all trapped in a nightmare, reliving the same day over and over again." The townsfolk stared at him, their faces shifting from blankness to confusion, then to fear. The mayor stepped forward, his face contorted with anger. "Don't listen to him," he shouted. "He's trying to destroy everything we've built." "What have you built?" Ethan retorted, his voice laced with scorn. "A facade, a lie. You're all hiding from the truth, afraid to face what happened here." He told them about the fire, about the greed and betrayal that had led to it. He told them about Silas, about his role in the tragedy and his eternal torment. He challenged them to remember, to confront their past, to break free from their self-imposed prison. "It won't be easy," he said, his voice softening. "It will be painful, but it's the only way to find peace, the only way to truly be redeemed." The choice was theirs. Would they take it? A tense silence hung over the square. The townsfolk looked at each other, their faces etched with doubt and fear. The mayor, desperate to maintain control, raised his hand, urging them to ignore Ethan, but something had shifted. A crack had appeared in redemption's perfect facade. A few faces in the crowd began to show glimmers of recognition, of long-suppressed memories surfacing. Ethan knew he had to push further. He lowered his gun and spoke, not to the crowd as a whole, but to each individual, his voice filled with raw honesty. "I'm not here to judge you," he said. "I'm not here to condemn you. I'm here to help you break free. But you can't do it alone. You need to face the truth, no matter how painful it may be." He then turned to the crowd and confessed his own past sins, the violence he had inflicted, the lives he had taken, the choices he regretted. He spoke of the darkness that haunted him, the guilt that weighed heavy on his soul. "I'm not a good man," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "But I'm trying to be better, and I believe that you can be too, but it starts with honesty. It starts with facing the truth." As he spoke, a transformation began to ripple through the crowd. Tears welled up in their eyes, their faces contorted with grief and remorse. The illusion of redemption began to crumble, revealing the scars of the past. It was time for the cycle to end. Ethan had made his choice. It was now up to them to make theirs. The transformation was slow but undeniable. The pristine buildings began to show their age, cracks appearing in the walls, paint peeling from the wood. The streets were no longer perfectly clean, dust and debris accumulating in the corners. The vibrant colors faded, replaced by the muted tones of reality. The townsfolk, no longer vacant-eyed mannequins, began to weep, to grieve, to remember. The weight of their past settled upon them, heavy but liberating. They started talking, sharing their stories, their regrets, their hopes for the future. Silas, his face no longer etched with despair, emerged from the crowd, his eyes filled with a newfound sense of peace. He approached Ethan, his hand outstretched. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You freed us all." Ethan shook his hand, a faint smile playing on his lips. He had come to redemption to collect a debt, but he had found something far more valuable, a chance to make a difference, to help a town heal, to confront his own demons. He mounted Jericho, his gaze sweeping over the changing town. It was no longer perfect, but it was real. It was scarred, but it was alive. It was a town on the road to redemption. He turned Jericho towards the setting sun, a new sense of purpose filling his soul. He was no longer just a hired gun. He was something more. He rode off into the unknown, forever changed by his experience in redemption, leaving behind a town finally ready to face its future. The debt was forgotten. Ethan was free.